They moved my fence 6 feet onto my land, so I took the front entrance to their whole neighborhood down, and I didn't raise my voice once. It still makes me smile when I think about that first laugh, the kind that isn't funny, but is the only sound you make when something absurd tries to pass for normal. It was a Monday night in early fall, the air sharp with cut grass, someone 2 roads over burning leaves where they shouldn't, and I was humming along to a country song with the windows down, thinking about nothing in particular. Until the mailbox looked wrong. When you live on land for a long time, you know it. Like the lines on your hands, every dip, every post hole, every tree that leans the wrong way in a storm. I have almost 3 acres on a corner lot outside of a new subdivision called Briar Glen. My place was here long before the developer arrived with their brochures and polite smiles. My dad cleared this ground in the late 80s with a chainsaw, a borrowed tractor, and a stubbornness that became the backbone of everything I own. I grew up stacking wood along that fence line. I learned how to measure distance with my steps. So when I drove up and saw fresh concrete and brand new posts sunk 6 feet inside where my old posts had been for 30 years, something in me just stopped and stared. They hadn't smashed the old fence. They'd taken it out almost ceremoniously, boards stacked in a neat pile on my side like someone tidying up after themselves, almost apologetic. And there, zip-tied to a shiny new post, was a little white sign, "Property boundary adjusted per revised development survey. Contact Briar Glen Community Association for questions." I actually laughed then, because when life leans so hard into audacity, your only sane response is a short, bitter laugh. And then you want to see the paperwork. I don't do HOAs. I pay county taxes, I fix my own road frontage, and I mind my business. I only bordered Briar Glen because the old Parker place got sold off after Mr. Parker passed, and some developer decided pasture was a better image as cul-de-sacs and model homes. 6 feet doesn't sound like much until you multiply it across 400 feet. That's room for a shed, for a garden, for years of taxes I've been paying on land that suddenly someone else thought they could redraw with a curve and a smile. So I walked the line twice, measured from the big sycamore stump from the culvert by the road, the markers my father and I had used for decades, and then I drove to the community office the next day. You know, the type small brick building, pretends at class, with decorative stone and a bubbling fountain out front, the whole thing staged to sell a feeling. The receptionist greeted me like I was expected. "Oh, you must be Mr. Carter. Mr. Holloway's been expecting you." That little phrase, "expecting you," told me everything I needed to know about how careful they were being. Greg Holloway came out with a grin that wouldn't travel to his eyes, pressed polo shirt, a practiced handshake. "Daniel, good to finally meet," he said, and I didn't shake his hand. I watched the grin for a second, and then I said very plainly, "You moved my fence." He sighed, called it a correction, a revised certified survey, a discrepancy in the original developer documentation. He used words like aligning and visual flow. "It improves the visual flow of the neighborhood entrance," he said, as if my land were a backdrop on a brochure. When someone tells you the reason they put a fence on your property is visual flow, that's the moment you find out who you're dealing with. They assumed I wouldn't mind. They assumed because my house sits older with a metal workshop and a tractor out front, I'd be easier to bend around. That assumption was the wrong calculus. I drove to the county records that afternoon, that place that smells like old paper and burnt coffee, and the kind of bureaucracy that only becomes interesting if it touches your life. A clerk named Marisol rescued me from the maze of drawers. She had practical kindness written in the way she moved. We laid the original plat from 1989 over their subdivision plan from 5 years ago, and the screen did what screens do. It made the lie look thin. My eastern boundary had never legally moved, but the ornate stone entrance for Briar Glen curved into my corner by as much as 12 feet, in places not 6. There was no recorded easement, no right-of-way, no paperwork at the county that would allow them to plant permanent stone and run a waterfall on my ground. Just a handshake years ago between my father and some hopeful salesperson who wanted a prettier curve at the road. If I could hear my dad right then, he'd say, "Son, always get it in writing. Even if you trust the man, especially if you trust the man." We didn't get it in writing. We took a neighborly promise and a cup of coffee like people did then, and believed in mutual respect. That's a lesson that tastes different when the stakes are a chunk of your land. I called Leonard Briggs, a local property attorney who'd helped a friend years back. He met me above a hardware store with a manila folder and the kind of focus that makes you feel safer. They can commission all the surveys they want. he said, flipping through pages. But unless there's a mutual agreement or a judge's order, you don't get to move boundary markers that have been recognized for decades. He was calm in a way that made me calm, which is useful because anger doesn't file deeds. Leonard recommended the by-the-book rote record of formal revocation of any implied permission for structures on my parcel, give reasonable notice, let them respond, and if they don't, remove the encroachment. Reasonable time. Those words sounded smaller than visual flow, and they mattered more. By noon, I'd filed the notice. By 3, it was stamped. I mailed a certified copy to Briar Glen Community Association, and predictably Greg called. "Daniel received something from the county today," he began, voice tight. "This seems unnecessary." "So did moving my fence," I said. He talked about community reliance, identity, property values, the usual chorus. I listened. I didn't raise my voice. Leonard told me to give them 10 business days. I gave them 5. On the 6th, the flatbed rolled onto my property just after sunrise. I'd hired a licensed crew, no theatrics, just folks in reflective vests and machinery doing the lawful thing. Greg showed up in a tie thrown on in the car, red-faced. "You can't seriously be doing this," he said. I handed him the recorded notice and a survey overlay. "We are removing structures that sit on my property without a legal easement," I said. He snapped about hurting the neighborhood, about property values, as if the hurt wasn't inflicted the day they decided my land should be theirs for a prettier entrance. They picked up the stone blocks. Carefully. Lights were unbolted and unwired. The pump for the little waterfall drained, not destruction, subtraction. People came out of their houses, whispers and phone photos, and the sort of suburban theater that gathers around the unexpected. Delivery drivers started treating Briar Glen as a normal street they passed through, where once a gate had given them pause, kids found a shortcut. Cars flowed differently. The illusion of exclusivity is fragile when the thing that made it feel special simply disappears. Greg called that evening, voice softer. "You've made your point," he said. He offered to move my fence back, but then his tone shifted and he asked for an easement, monthly compensation, acknowledgement of the mistake, and reimbursement for taxes. "You're extorting us," he accused. I laughed a small, tired laugh and told him I didn't move anything that wasn't mine. Here's the twist. People don't expect the neighborhood I'd been told I was upsetting began to show up on my porch. Not lawyers, not polished board members, but neighbors. A couple I'd seen walking their dog, a veteran with tired eyes, came to sit at my kitchen table. They'd been worried about security and property values. They'd seen the posts in the neighborhood group. But when I laid the maps and the old plat on the table, the same maps Greg had dismissed, they quieted. They weren't there to argue, they were there to understand. The veteran who later brought me a 6-pack and said he respected what I did summed it up best. "We don't like chaos, but we do like fairness." It turned out they'd been sold the idea that the entrance belonged by right to the association was more fragile than the stone it was carved into. The board met in a different place than their staged brick office in my workshop, with a tractor parked like a stubborn witness. They brought their attorney, they brought new tones and fewer rehearsed lines. "It appears the original boundary line is, in fact, as you stated," one of them said at last. Negotiation is a different kind of fight. Quieter, precise, oddly intimate. I asked for a proper easement, recorded and legal market rate compensation for frontage usage, written acknowledgement of the prior error, reimbursement for the tax overvaluation, and that they restore my fence at their expense. A board member in his 30s exhaled and admitted it was substantial. I reminded him what 6 extra feet had cost me for decades, not just in money, but in principle. Respect costs less than assumption. They agreed eventually. Lawyers exchanged drafts, language was tightened like a seam ink finally hit paper. The entrance was rebuilt, but this time it was different, placed within a proper easement boundary, simpler, less theatrical. The waterfall replaced with something functional instead of showy. No creeping edges, no landscaping that blurred lines. My fence went back new posts, reinforced footings, and I stood there as they set, every single one. Watching them secure the last board felt like closing a loop. What satisfied me wasn't seeing the stones gone and then back again. It was seeing an agreement where once there had been assumption, and feeling the honest weight of a line that wouldn't be redrawn by whim. Justice in this case wasn't theatrical revenge. It was paperwork and patience and being willing to stand still and document what was yours. Greg and I stood and watched cars pass under the rebuilt sign. "This didn't have to escalate," he said finally. "You're right," I replied. "It didn't. but it also didn't need to have started with a presumption that my quiet would be permission. After the neighborhood adjusted, delivery routes changed back, teenagers found other shortcuts, online chatter softened. A few folks started waving when they passed my corner, a couple stopped by to properly introduce themselves. The veteran dropped by sometimes to talk about small things and hand me cold beer. He didn't cheer because chaos had followed, he respected the line drawn and defended. If there's a moral here, it's not a lecture. It's a small personal truth that settled on me like dust on a porch rail. Records matter, promises do too. But if promises aren't put down on paper, they're fragile. Power sometimes disguises itself as consensus. A dozen polite nods don't make something legal. And standing up for your boundary, whether it's land, a line in a relationship, or a line in the sand, is less about aggression and more about refusing to be quietly erased. So here's where I leave you, sitting on my porch some evenings, headlights sweeping across that sign that still says Briar Glen Preserve, knowing that the ground beneath the light exists there because I allowed it, and because this time it's written down. 6 feet doesn't sound like much until it is, until it becomes the thing that lets someone else decide what belongs to you. Was I justified? Should I have tried harder to compromise before asking for their entrance to be dismantled? Or was it necessary to show that assumptions have consequences when someone treats your property like it's optional? If you were in my place, what would you have done? Stay silent, sue, or take a quieter, measured stand and file the paperwork? Tell me your story. Tell me what you think. If you've ever tangled with a community association, a boundary dispute, or a neighbor who presumed too much, share this with someone who'll understand. Because sometimes protecting what's yours isn't about anger. It's about standing still and refusing to move.